The home gives its 6 mildly retarded male residents the opportunity to perform capably in the community and have a family life. The house also accommodates mentally retarded citizens whose families need to leave them in an emergency.
We had no place for any of the older clients to live in case they found themselves without parents. Our board several years ago conceived the idea of a home for the mentally retarded here in Montgomery. And it was after looking at many locations and checking into various zoning and other regulations that we were fortunate enough to find this older home here, which is centrally located.
Local merchants and civic organizations donated the furnishings and helped with the restoration of the house. The Montgomery Association for Retarded Citizens is next planning a home like this for women. And how have the residents adjusted so far?
The men like it great. When one of the particular residents came for a look, he told Ms. Maddox, who is the administrator of this home, that he would come if he could plant a rose bush and have a dog. And he's going to get to plant his rose bush, and we intend to have a dog here for a pet.
Jane Matheson, WSFA TV News.
Atlantic Southeast came to Montgomery on January 11th with 4 round-trip flights to Atlanta Monday through Friday, 2 on Saturday, and 3 on Sunday. So far, airline representatives say the average flight is about 60% full, and some of those flights are very close to the 17-passenger maximum capacity level. ASA officials attribute much of the airline's success to advertisements, which they started using several weeks before the airline even got here. They say another drawing card is word of mouth, because once people ride the airline, they'll go back and tell others. But scheduled Skyways isn't doing as well. The airline has 1 flight a day to Birmingham, which goes on to Memphis. And since both airlines share Eastern's old terminal space, representatives from ASA are handling Skyways passengers at the ticket counter, as well as doing the airline's paperwork. Skyways has been here almost 3 months, and Representative Ken Green says the monthly figures show an average of 3.5 passengers per flight. So last week, Skyways announced a big reduction in airfare. It now costs $29 one way to Birmingham and $49 round trip, $43 less than other airlines in this area flying the same route. Green says advertisement has been limited, but says he's hopeful the reduced airfare will encourage more people to fly scheduled Skyways and help the airline break even in this area. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
Their scouting career began as Cub Scouts, Webelow Scouts, Tenderfoots, then second and first class Scouts to Star, Life, and then finally to the Eagle Scout, the goal of every Boy Scout. Throughout their career, the Eagle Scouts, representing 7 councils across Alabama, did their good turn daily while helping other people at all times as kind, obedient, and cheerful Scouts. Boy Scouts across the country stand by the motto, be prepared, and so does Auburn's new head football coach, Pat Dye.
There's not a soul in here that's successful in anything that can't look back and say somebody else helped me get to where I am today.
The Scouts informed former Governor George Wallace of the total number of youths involved in Alabama's scouting program last year, over 91,000. Governor Fob James told the Scouts what fine young servicemen they are.
I cannot help but know that obtaining the Eagle is a mark of real leadership. And there is no questions. The lessons learned here will pay tremendous dividends as years go by.
Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Not really from...
and the founders, which remind me of the story they tell about the minister, university for colored students and teachers to operate.
extensive cross-examination, PSC staff members pointed out to Elmore Coosa Telephone Company officials that they had filed for the increase under an outdated statute. As it turned out, PSC staff members say the telephone company's earnings on their return investment are already at least equal to the increases they were asking for. The Elmore Coosa Telephone Company was requesting a near 26% increase for residential and business customers in Kalijah, Eclectic, and Camp Hill, Alabama. Telephone company officials say since their last rate increase in 1975, operational costs have increased and the 1975 rates don't supply sufficient revenue. However, after today's hearing, telephone company officials agreed to withdraw their request without prejudice. They can file for an increase under the new statute at a later time. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Siegelman says Alabama needs a new Financial Disclosure Act because the current corrupt practices law has so many loopholes it may even encourage corruption. He says he's negotiating with legislators who might want to sponsor a new Financial Disclosure Act. One loophole he hopes to close allows candidates to keep their contributors secret until after the election. The new law would require disclosure 10 to 15 days before an election. The law would also define when a person becomes a candidate. Siegelman says some people collect donations before they file for candidacy, and so those early donations go unreported. The Fair Political Practices Commission would investigate complaints about campaign practices, including intimidation of voters, the promise of political appointments in exchange for support, and contributions made by one person in someone else's name. Siegelman's attempts to get the legislature to pass a similar bill last year failed, but he says he's made some changes suggested by those who opposed last year's version of the bill. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
During Tuesday night's State of the State address, Governor James said he would recommend a $24 million cut in funding to higher education, but now that figure has been revised. The governor's dollar figure was based on proration being at 7%, but proration has been increased to 10%, and Press Secretary Chris Bentz says it takes less of a cut to reach the governor's recommended level at that level of proration. So now it will apparently only take a cut of about $11 million to accomplish the governor's proposal. According to Bentz, the $11 million would cover cuts to the four-year colleges as well as the junior and technical schools. A final worksheet on the proposed cuts hasn't been completed, but Bentz says it'll be ready by next week when the governor is required by law to present his Special Education Trust Fund and General Fund budget proposals to the legislature. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Siegelman has drawn up a bill that deals with what he calls the most urgent need in Alabama election laws, a sound law for disclosing campaign finances.
The current laws, which were meant to prevent corrupt practices, are so poorly drafted so that they are now determined to be ineffective. They've been declared unenforceable, and they perhaps serve as a trap for the unwary candidate, and in some cases, I think, even encourage corruption rather than prevent it.
Siegelman's proposed finance disclosure acts haven't gotten anywhere in the past two sessions, but he says he thinks there's now genuine concern among legislators, especially since statewide elections are coming up again in 1982. Siegelman's bill would create a 6-member Fair Political Practices Commission. The commission would administer the new act, whose major points include better information for candidates on where and when to file campaign finance information, and clear definition of when a person becomes a candidate, so that he won't have a lot of contributions that go unreported before he actually files for office. The act would also require political action committees formed by business corporations to bear the corporation's name, and would require candidates to reveal their contributors before rather than after an election. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
It's not red. Once we've done that, I think it was one that was the other one. For total man hours of 1,000. Well,
Would it require any updating on the plan?
They would be up to date. 74. At that time, the estimated cost was $460,498, of which $64,000.
Alabama, a tornado hit a school. Bob Jimenez reports on that.
In the small town of Bay Minette, about 35 miles from Mobile, a tornado hit a middle school where 300 students had just begun classes. It blew out windows, knocked in walls, and destroyed the school gymnasium. No one was killed, but ambulances, buses, and police cars rushed more than 40 injured people to hospitals, where anxious parents waited. 2 students were in serious condition after part of the gymnasium wall fell in on them. Many of the injured suffered cuts, bruises, and broken bones. One youngster who pulled another student to safety said there was little warning.
When the lights went off, everybody started screaming, run up to the front. And then it sounded like a tree hit the window and glass. The windows broke. And
Authorities say if the tornado had struck later in the day when the gymnasium was full of students, there would have been many deaths. Bob Jimenez, NBC News, Mobile, Alabama.
A federal trade... It takes so much time. You got to be prepared. Mess with me. You might even bring the Lindsay out here.
We have a lot of young ladies that are playing with us right now that were All-Americans and collegians, and a lot of young ladies that have played with us for the first time as professionals and weren't allowed to, either by circumstances, to play collegiate golf, and are trying now for a professional career, readying themselves to play on the LPGA.
The LPGA must love this tour.
We have become sanctioned in the last couple of years by the LPGA, and we have been told in the last couple of years that they realize now that we are their future. There are 85 young ladies playing on from our tour on their tour now, and a couple of weeks ago at the LPGA qualifying school, they took 9 players. They were all from our tour. We're very, very proud and very happy to be associated with the LPGA now.
How do you raise the money for the purse?
We have local sponsors, and we are looking right now for some local sponsorships in the area to raise the purse. We want to have a $10,000 purse for the girls to play with while they're here in town. And we have about 60 young ladies that are coming to join us from all over the United States. We have gals playing with us right now from Australia, from England, from Canada, and we really expect a good field.
soldiers accident happened here last week. And their general beliefs and specific attitudes. She touched him here and there. But the cause is very weak material. Has very little on it.
What happened to the old business that we used to get them fixed? You know, that men would be unemployed.
And there's no better gift, really. So a living blood bank in honor of Dr. Silas Garrett and in memory of Mrs. Elaine Garrett, sponsored by Omicron Chapter of Dr. Delta.
And I hope the rest of our meeting, if you can stay and enjoy that as well, would go up. Do you mind?
Alabama Power Company officials and Public Service Commission President Billy Joe Camp say they're quite pleased with the audit. Both call the report a fair and factual study of what goes on at the power company and PSC. The main question the PSC wanted answered was, is the fuel adjustment clause and fuel cycle currently used by Alabama Power being conducted in an efficient and economical manner? The auditing firm's overall conclusion was that the company's fuel-related procedures are the most appropriate methods used for recovery of fuel costs. Power company officials say fuel adjustment increases are necessary to recover energy maintenance and inflationary costs and not to make a profit. Power company Vice President Hugh Foreman says the auditing report comes as no surprise.
We think we're doing a good job. We have always felt that way. We're wide open. Everybody in the world's examined us. There's nothing to hide.
The power company and PSC will discuss the recommendations of the report at next Thursday's meeting. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Have you had any direct contact with Mr. Reagan or his staff members at this point?
Yes, we have some sort of dialogue. We had some dialogue with the Carter administration also. You cannot solve problems without policy people coming and putting their heads together. But they were very sparse ones, I should say. And I hope the contact will be stepped up also, I hope.
The bill to change the collection times of income taxes, sponsored by Representative Eric Cates of Greenville. He says the bill would make employers who withhold more than $1,000 in income tax from their employees per month turn that money into the state at the end of each month, rather than once every 3 months as they do now. Cates says this would bring an extra $62 million during the first fiscal year because of the earlier collections, but wouldn't do anything to change the amount of tax collected. That bill will now go to the Senate. Representative Lee Pegues of Marion won unanimous approval of his bill that would change the sunset law. Pegues' bill makes a number of changes in which agencies are automatically reviewed. Tuscaloosa's Representative Roy Johnson convinced the House to pass a resolution rejecting the Judicial Compensation Committee's recommendation of a 7.5% pay raise for certain judges. That bill was sent to the Senate but bogged down and was sent to the Senate Rules Committee. If the Senate fails to act on that resolution, the pay raises go into effect automatically. Representative James Sasser of Ozark won approval of his amended bill to increase the penalties and remove any possible juvenile status for those convicted of crimes against the elderly, blind, or mentally or physically handicapped. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
The Senate passed a measure that no longer allows attorneys to keep people from serving on a jury just because they're more than 65 years old. Another bill that came up was Senator Pat Vaca's proposal to require all children under 5 to use safety seats while riding in cars. Vaca says a similar law in Tennessee has saved many lives. But several senators had questions about the law's effect on carpools and on tourists passing through the state. So Senator Vaca agreed to carry the bill over until next week. Several other bills got favorable reports from Senate committees. The Health and Welfare Committee reported out a bill that would exempt church-operated child care centers from state licensing. That means churches could set their own regulations, including, as committee members pointed out, the right to spank children as a punishment. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
The package of 4 bills sponsored by Committee Chairman Jack Venable of Tallahassee is designed to close a loophole in the original legislation creating tax-free municipal bonds. Venable contends the Wallace Cater Act of the 1950s wasn't supposed to include retail outlets, but during the past year, as many as a dozen retailers have used the tax-free bonds to start their businesses, something State Securities Commission Director Tom Krebs says could be costing the state as much as $20 million in lost sales and ad valorem taxes. A large contingency of opponents to Venable's bills argue that the tax-free bonds is about the only way retail outlet construction can continue in what was described by one of them as these crazy financial times. The package of 4 bills will now go to the full House. In other committee action in the Ways and Means Committee, Representative Jack Biddle won uncontested approval of a bill to exempt all prescription drugs from sale taxes. Fiscal notes show there would be a loss of nearly $5 million to the Education Trust Fund, but Biddle says that will be recouped through 2 other bills he's sponsoring that would increase the tax on food sold in vending machines and amend the collection of taxes on the casual sales of automobiles. The House Ways and Means Committee also gave a favorable report to a bill that would allow local school boards to transfer money around as needed, despite objections from AEA Executive Secretary Paul Hubbard, who says the bill would allow local superintendents to create their own slush funds. And in the Highway Safety Committee, Representative Pete Turnham won approval of a bill to require child restraints in automobiles. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
It was an emotion-filled day as families of murder victims told their touching stories and pleaded for a death penalty to deter similar crimes. And just as fervent were pleas not to pass the bill from people who don't believe the bill would be administered fairly or that society has a right to take a life. The bill was drawn up under the supervision of Attorney General Charles Graddick. He says unlike parts of the present law, this bill is constitutional.
The scales of justice in this state, in this country, have tipped a little bit too far towards protecting the rights of the criminal defendant at the expense of their own victims. It's time now for us to do something.
But I want to spare somebody, somewhere, what I've been through, what my family's been through. You talk about deterrent of crime. Yes, I do believe it's deterrent, but I want you to know I don't care. They gave up their right to live.
Most of these men that are on death row have killed before, and if they had been killed the first time, they wouldn't have killed the second time. So if it don't deter one man out on the street that hadn't killed yet, it would deter those.
Has the death penalty in Florida deterred the killings in Dade County? Has it deterred the killings in Atlanta or Dallas or Houston?
It seems to me that we live in a day when we are surrounded by frustration and fear. We live in a fearful nation. We are all frustrated by violence. What worries me is that all of that frustration tends to come to focus in things like capital punishment.
14 people spoke against the bill, 12 spoke for it. But the feeling expressed most often about the bill's future is that it will pass with an overwhelming majority. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Unhappy. But we are
Lieutenant Governor George McMillan welcomed the cattlemen to Montgomery. And like Governor James earlier today, McMillan talked a little about the state's financial predicament. He asked the cattlemen and their wives to support their state representatives and senators and asked them not to make unrealistic demands on the lawmakers, particularly in this time of financial difficulty. Then the female branch of the Cattlemen's Association, the Cowbells, held their annual auction with proceeds going toward beef promotion and advertisements. After the auction, Nashville comedian Jerry Clower told some of the stories that made him famous, like those on the Ledbetter family, and of course his famous coon hunting story. Clower began his career in Alabama talking to cattlemen's groups around the state. Then it was on to Nashville.
The automobile industry, they in trouble. Foreign folks. The computer folks, they in trouble. Other lands coming in on them. But you want to know something about agriculture or know how to raise cattle or know how to farm, you come to America. because y'all do it better than anybody else.
Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
We challenge each and every Alabama public official to speak to the people of this state and prove, if they can, that the death penalty is fair, that it is right, that it will work, and that it is needed. This requires evidence. The death penalty question deserves our best minds, our best researchers, and our most skillful politicians.
After finally approving the $20,000 funding for the state's 3 regional law enforcement training facilities, LEPA Executive Committee members squabbled over the governor's recommendation to consolidate the 3 training academies with the Department of Public Safety's State Trooper Academy in Selma. The funding for the training centers is good only through the end of this fiscal year. After October, LEPA officials say they don't know where new monies will come from to train new officers. The $60,000 total for this year's operation came from the Special Education Trust Fund and LEPA's budget. Colonel Jerry Shoemaker of the Department of Public Safety supports a uniform training center. He says the Selma Academy has a complete 10-classroom building facility. Shoemaker says he hasn't talked with the governor on the consolidation probability, but says he plans to. However, LEPA Director Bo Davis says many sheriffs don't like the consolidation idea.
Personally, I would think the sheriffs would be opposed to being trained by the State Department of Public Safety. However, I feel that some type of compromise training arrangement could be worked out and will be worked out if we continue to have training beginning in October of this year.
Davis says if the state isn't able to fund the 3 training academies, the merger probably will take place this October, but not without some dispute first. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Which one? The left.
Will you see if you can get a hold of the preacher?
Are you all waiting for someone? Are you supposed to be in the cafeteria?
Scotty Smith.
Scotty Smith?
Yes.
Tell me what happened. at Overton School?
Well, we sitting in desk and it got kind of bad, so our teacher told us to pull the shades down and pull the desk up. And we pulled the desk up, and I was picking my books up, and then the electricity went off. And she told everybody before that to run up to the front if anything happened. And so when the lights went off, everybody started screaming, run up to the front. And then it sounded like a tree hit the window and glass. The windows broke. And
When did you first know it was a tornado?
You're very, very kind. I hope you can shoot tonight. I'm very grateful. Thank you, sir. Contemporary production of the perfection of such a ball at the beginning of Ming Dynasty, 1500. Sotheby Burnett, together with Lane. I have just gotten report at the time I left Washington, and that we have take quite a while before port facilities on the West Coast could be developed into perhaps the magnitude, the size.
Was an excellent quarterback, and we had a sophomore that was just as good. And as a matter of fact, we've got 4 to go. We've signed one since the last count, but hopefully the next 4 are going to be, big ones. And we've got, we got some key players that if we sign it, it really help our year as far as recruiting is concerned.
I know recruiting is always a guessing game, but you must have some feel for it this year.
Well, I'm always optimistic about the kids that we recruit. I like the character that we've gotten. I know some of them have enough ability to play in this conference. Probably going to take some of them, several years to develop. But the real criteria of how good a year we've had will be determined over the next 4 or 5 years.
Governor James told the cattlemen, Auburn officials, and a handful of state legislators that it's time to restruct some of the fundamental wrongdoings in the state government. The governor's proposals to the state legislature cover some of these areas. The governor's particularly against earmarked taxes. He says the public should be allowed to vote on the issue.
Over 88% of taxes you pay are earmarked before they ever get down here. Earmarked 40, 50, 30, 25 years ago. I beg and plead that you take a very vital interest in what senator will not allow the people of Alabama to vote on that issue in the general primary 2 years from now.
The governor says the only ones profiting are the special interest groups, and the public interest has not been served. Governor James told the group that the state government's overpriced, and he's not willing to buy it. Jane Matheson, WSFA, TV News.
The track at Garrett Coliseum is considered one of the fastest in the country. The high bank turns and straightaways have attracted some of the greatest names in track and field. Past performers at the Coliseum include Stanley Floyd, Houston McTeer, Harvey Glantz, James Mallard, Mel Latney, and Clifford Outland in the sprints. The world's top 2 intermediate hurdlers a year ago, Edwin Moses and James Walker, both turned in stellar Coliseum performances at one time or another, as have Dick Berkeley, Willie Smith, Jan Johnson, Joe Coombs, and Ray Robinson. The list goes on. This weekend at the Southern Indoor Championships, the attention will focus on the high jump area, where yet another big name will be competing. Montgomery Track Association President Jim Brown explains.
We have Jeff Woodard, who is unattached this year at the University of Alabama, and he had the record high jump last year of 7.7 1/4. He will be here. Have several other good jumpers, Jay Gonzalez from Auburn, and Shelby Andrews from Troy State, and Mac Reese from Georgia Tech, and Warner Brown from the Atlanta Track Club. All of these fellows have jumped over 7 feet.
This weekend's meet marks a homecoming of sorts for Charles Oliver, a competitor in the 440-yard dash. A track All-American at Troy State 2 years ago, Oliver now runs for the Philadelphia Pioneers Track Club. He comes to Montgomery after competing in last week's Millrose Games. The competition gets underway Saturday at 12:30, and a final Sunday session starts at 1 o'clock. Dave Cody, WSFA TV Sports.
A number of prominent speakers, including Governor Fob James, traced Tuskegee Institute's history back to its beginning. In 1881, then Governor Rufus Cobb signed a bill that gave blacks in Macon County a yearly $2,000 appropriation for the establishment of a school in the area. The residents appointed a three-man board of commissioners to supervise the school's operations and to find a principal. The three board members, Lewis Adams, George Campbell, and Thomas Dreyer, got together and hired Booker T. Washington from Hampton Institute. The four men recognized the need for blacks in the area to have a sufficient education to go along with their newfound freedom. And now, 100 years later, the group was challenged to imitate the basic educational ideals held by Tuskegee's founders. Then George Adams's oldest living descendant, Mrs. Lily Motley Wilson, accepted a special trophy in recognition of her grandfather's work. And Charles Campbell, the oldest living descendant of George Campbell, accepted a similar award for his family. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News, Tuskegee.
EPA officials say samples of the land within the past year revealed between 7.2 and 579 parts per million of PCB. Any number over 50 indicates contamination.
Basically, what this team would need to know in terms of defining the parameters or the limits of the problem. We're not really sure what we have, except we know we have some PCBs, and we know that some degree of application of solution to the problem must be made.
Besides sampling, health officials say they'll build dikes around the area so the chemical won't spread to the nearby Tanyard Creek, which so far only shows a low level of PCB. When the degree of contamination is determined, the agencies will then move in to clean up and restore the land and determine its health impacts. Health scientist Gene French says PCB is not proven to be carcinogenic to humans, but large doses will affect the liver and reproductive system. The contamination results from the transformer repair shop across the street dumping the chemical into a connected sewer. Company manager Alan Parker says the dumping occurred before 1975, when it was still legal to use PCB as a flame retardant in transformers. In Greenville, Jane Matheson, WSFA TV News. Before 1975, Mowbray Engineering used PCB as a heat retardant in electrical equipment. Then the federal government banned the chemical because it caused cancer in laboratory animals. Now health officials say the PCB that was dumped from the plant's electrical transformers has contaminated this portion of land nearby and may have spread to area waterways. Alabama water improvement representatives, a regional response team, and federal EPA officials are meeting to discuss what action to take on the spill. Mowbray plant manager Alan Parker says the company was earlier asked to clean up the property, which he says would cost around $35,000. Parker says the transformer repair company is near bankruptcy and can't afford that cost. Parker is here questioning the health officials about the cleanup request because he says the PCB was dumped before it was banned. In Greenville, Jane Matheson, WSFA TV News.
This morning, Dickinson in town, meeting with local constituents, invited the news media to his office for a question and answer session. It's the first news conference he's held here this year. He talked a lot about defense spending, national security, and the economy. In regard to the economic policy of the Reagan administration, he says he's most optimistic.
I feel good about it. We all recognize there's got to be some drastic changes.
Asked about the possible consolidation of all military helicopter pilot training at Fort Rucker, Dickinson had this to say.
There are politics involved. The Department of Defense had made its decision. If they say they're going to put money in the budget and they're going to support it, then I'm going to enthusiastically carry the banner for it. And if they don't think it's a good idea and we can't get their support, looking at the history of the past record, when we had the support of the Department of Defense, I think we'd just be wasting our time.
Dickinson has pushed for the consolidation for several years now, but has run into strong opposition in Congress. Meanwhile, U.S. Senator Howell Heflin is asking the Defense Department to determine if Fort Rucker has the capability to train all of the military's helicopter pilots. Congressman Dickinson says Rucker could easily handle the combined training with a savings of $150 million during the first 5 years. Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
The lengthy discussion on how to best approach the question began through what is a routine procedure to codify all laws passed last year. But Representative Rick Manley's bill would have called for those 7 words to be included in the code book. Current versions of the code don't include those 7 words as a part of the law. But Representative Charles Adams offered an amendment that would specifically prevent those 7 words from becoming a part of the law. Adams says both houses of the legislature deleted those 7 words, even though a conference committee later put the sentence back in. Adams' bill died after House Speaker Joe McCorkadale pointed out that Adams' amendment would be a dangerous precedent in amending a law outside the method for achieving that end. Manley then substituted his own bill with another that makes no reference at all to the question of whether the 7 words should or should not be included. Manley's substitute passed 73-3. During the debate, Representative Bob Gafford of Birmingham, who sponsored the interest rate bill, maintained his plea that he did nothing underhanded to include the sentence once it reached the conference committee. All the while, Adams said he knew he was proposing a dangerous precedent, but wanted the House to have a chance to speak on the issue. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
The vote was unanimous to reject the pay raises. Senators apparently agreed with the letter from Montgomery Circuit Judge Perry Hooper that asked the legislature to hold the line on this year's raises. Hooper said the legislature has been generous in the past, granting raises until Alabama judges' salaries equaled those in other states. And the Senate Judiciary Committee gave a favorable report to the new death penalty bill. The vote was 11-2. Voting against the bill were Senators Mike Figures of Mobile and Earl Hilliard from Birmingham. Hilliard had offered 3 amendments that would have deleted sections of the bill. Attorney General Charles Graddick says the amendments would have made the law unconstitutional. All 3 changes were voted down. Figures said he'd never seen a bill ramrodded through the legislature so fast in what he called an atmosphere of prejudice. He said the emotional testimony at a public hearing made everyone so bloodthirsty they didn't give the bill proper consideration. Montgomery Senator Don Harrison said he did a lot of soul-searching before casting his vote for the death penalty. He said he was thinking of his own children and decided that if the bill will prevent one child from being killed, then it's worth it. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Member of the Crime Prevention Program and a special member indeed, and signed by our Executive Director Linda M. Smith on this 12th day of February 1981. It's a great pleasure to make this presentation to you guys.
I might say that Bill Bowling is an employee of Wallace State Community College at Hansville. I issued a memorandum last week to the governor and the State Board of Education that demonstrated that Hansville has not been honest with the Commission on Higher Education in its arguments that it needs the Southern Benedictine campus because they do not have classroom space available on the main campus. You never know what motivates legislators, but I would say that Mr. Bowling, who's an employee of that school, might not have liked my memorandum.
And he raised 12 of them to get grown, and 3 were boys and the rest were girls. They would come to his shop and ask him to teach them the trades that he knew. And he started trying to teach some of them, but as the crowd grew too large for them, it was too much for him to try to teach them and give that much time to them.
I remember going, seeing him at the bank, visiting with him there, had many little visits around Tuskegee, and heard him talk about Booker T. Washington. He probably talked more about Booker T. Washington in Tuskegee Institute than almost anything else. He was a banker, and he was a conservative banker, but he believed in helping.
Not too quick, but I think they're strong. They like to play a control kind of ball game.
I guess you're expecting a close contest.
They are the Northern champs, and we always respect the champs.
Last week, the last game, you won the sub-state tournament against South Girard, and we're looking at some of the pictures now from that. The press worked very effectively for McIntyre.
That's something we worked hard on, and we like to use the press 4 quarters because we like to kind of control the tempo of the game. We like to make teams play our game, and therefore we can kind of concentrate on the outcome when we really run it and press.
Your kids respond so well.
Because I think we've done it all year long. We have done it regular season and through the playoffs, and I think we almost can run it to perfection now.
What do you think about the year for McIntyre? You're undefeated. Did you ever think it could be that way?
We thought we'd be successful, but I didn't know about being undefeated. We anticipated having a successful year.
How does this group match up with those in '78 that won the state championship?
Well, the '78 team are champions, but we can't comment until we're champions.
That may just be Saturday night, right, Coach?
Hopefully.
Alvin Mumford's hot hand helped Auburn overcome a 2-point deficit early in the second half. The 6'2" sophomore hit 4 baskets in a hurry. His early second half surge was an indication of things to come, as Auburn hit 16 of 20 for an incredible 80% from the field in the second half. Mumford banks it home here for 2 more of his 14 on the night. Frank Poindexter exploded in the late going, accounting for 16 of his game-high 21 points in the final 7 minutes. The Tigers' 6'6" sophomore forward scored at will from the Vandy baseline. The 15,000 fans came to their feet trying to arouse their Commodores, but Poindexter continued to drill them home. Vandy did cut a 7-point Auburn lead to 4 on Willie Jones' slam dunk, but this time the Tigers refused to fold. Instead, they poured it on, with Poindexter doing most of the damage. Auburn was patient, looking for the open man. Paul Daniels with a nice bounce pass. Poindexter slams it home. Auburn 69, Vanderbilt 55, the bitter memory of 11 straight conference losses for a time forgotten. Dave Cody, WSFA TV Sports.
They tell me Jeff Woodard's here. He's not competing for the University of Alabama, but he is maybe the top high jumper in the country, as he ended up winning the Milrose games last week. We have a young fellow named David Spivey who won the pole vault here last year as a junior college athlete, transferred to our school, and he's vaulting 17 feet. He may be the best pole vault I've seen in the South since Jan Johnson. John Tuttle is going to try the 2-mile. We're anxious to see what Roger Jones does in the 1,000. Some of our quarter miles and 600 men are mixing their events up, and well, looking forward to seeing what they can do. But the track is good. Everybody should know that the Montgomery track may be one of the fastest board tracks in the nation, and the people will run fast. Whether we have any records, I don't know. But I do know that most of the schools will come away knowing their athletes have competed pretty well.
regional response team is building a road to get into the property so they can begin the containment process.
We're going to construct some earthen berms around the left bank in between Tanyard Branch and the swamp to funnel the water to a central location here. And the same type of burn system will be done on the right bank as well. And a peat moss fence will be constructed at the mouth of the berm area to allow the water to run off.
The contaminated land came to federal attention through an anonymous phone call to the county health department about an oil spill. As it turns out, the PCBs were contained in oil that had been used as a heat retardant inside electrical transformers. The oil was dumped there by a transformer repair shop nearby. The company says because of federal regulations, it hasn't used or dumped the chemical in over 5 years, but EPA officials say the PCBs remain on the property.
PCB has a very long half-life, so it will be here.
EPA officials say the containment work should be finished in 2 to 3 days. By then, they say the sample results will be back, and they'll begin cleaning up the land. In Greenville, Jane Matheson, WSFA, TV News.
And he raised 12 of them to get grown, and 3 were boys and the rest were girls. They would come to his shop and ask him to teach them the trades that he knew. And he started trying to teach some of them, but as the crowd grew too large for them, it was too much for him to try to teach them and give that much time to them.
I remember going, seeing him at the bank, visiting with him there, had many little visits around Tuskegee, and heard him talk about Booker T. Washington. He probably talked more about Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute than almost anything else. He was a banker, and he was a conservative banker, but he believed in helping.
The 12 were all women. The charges against them varied, but their sentences, for the most part, are the same. 1 year and a day suspended sentence and probation. Even though the judge did suspend the sentences, he still ordered all but 2 to spend 1 week in jail, either on the weekends or all at once. Besides time in jail, the judge ordered the defendants to pay court costs, attorney's fees, and restitution. The women are also ordered to find full-time jobs, file for child support, and as a condition of their probation, attend family guidance. These welfare arrests and convictions are the result of an investigation by the Attorney General's office. Investigators uncovered more than $160,000 in fraudulent claims in the Montgomery area in 8 weeks. Of the 169 cases found, 94 are in the area of aid to dependent children, 49 for food stamp fraud, and 2 for daycare center fraud. The only woman sentenced this morning to receive more than 1 week in jail is Lucille Brodden. She was convicted of false pretense and theft for daycare center fraud and sentenced to 3 years in the penitentiary. Her request for parole was denied. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.